Well, on behalf of the GNAR initiative, I want to welcome everybody to the first of 5 different sessions of this Amenity migration series, which we have called Boomtown, Amenity Migration in the Rural West and the Rise of the Zoomtown. My name is Jake Powell. I'm with Utah State University Extension in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. And I wanted to start out by introducing the GNAR initiative. I have the opportunity to serve as the lead on the GNAR initiative. We use the acronym GNAR. It stands for Gateway and Natural Amenity Region. And who we are a product of USU's Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism. And we're a hub for researchers, practitioners, and community members who work to understand the unique challenges of gateway communities. And we're doing this through targeted research, sharing lessons with practitioners and students through education, and enhancing what makes gateway communities special through our capacity building efforts. The GNAR initiative is a little bit special in the fact that it's led by a volunteer core team and a steering committee that represents all the diverse viewpoints on the complicated subjects that happen in our communities. But really the GNAR initiative is for you. But it also, in that fact, it needs you as well. It's always been envisioned as a unifying location for people interested in gateway community issues to share their insights and add to this conversation, and hopefully build up the body of knowledge surrounding the planning and resiliency of special places like GNAR communities. So we hope that this is the start of maybe your interaction with the GNAR initiative. There are several ways that you can be involved. Many of you have already joined our community newsletter. That is really just an online forum that we can get in touch with you and you can stay up to date on all the information that the GNAR initiative is up to. If you are a community, we have what we call the GNAR network, which welcomes community practitioners, community leaders, community members to share their insights and lessons learned through peer-to-peer networking and learning opportunities. Also, you're welcome to join our leadership team. We are always open and interested in people who bring a diverse set of insights to our work and are invested in making the GNAR initiative better than it is today. So if you'd like to support the GNAR initiative, whether that be through your own efforts, if there are opportunities or resources you have to bring to the table, we would love to reach out and speak with you more, and you're welcome to send me an email. My email is jake.powell@usu.edu. And I would love to chat with you a little bit further about what you can bring to the table. With that idea of bringing things to the table, none of this can happen without some really awesome sponsorship by some of the organizations you see on the screen today. The North Face Explore Fund has been a generous sponsor of this effort, as well as the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. We also really want to reach out and extend a thanks to the University of Utah's Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment and USU Extension. So a little bit about the series that you're going to be participating in today. The GNAR initiative, and those of us who've been involved and watching over the past few months as COVID-19 and social unrest has really created a paradigm shift in our ability to work from anywhere, and has really accelerated this amenity migration phenomenon. We watched news stories of how housing prices have risen, and this celebration of this new liberty coming from the idea of a Zoomtown in the rural West. And we felt like there needs to be a much more complete conversation that wasn't really being facilitated by anybody else. And that's really the idea behind this series, is to create a space where we could explore the complexities and the nuances of this issue. So we're excited to have you here as part of part 1, where we discuss what brought us to this point and what pre-COVID amenity migration was like for gateway communities. Now, looking forward in our next session on October 29th, we're going to explore the current gateway amenity migration trends and the regional outlook for gateway communities. While neither all of this is good nor bad, amenity migration is happening. And on October 12th, we'll be showcasing the various voices of community representatives who are experiencing amenity migration in real time. And they'll be sharing with us their perspectives on how it's affecting their communities and professional positions. Moving forward, on the 19th of November, we'll be highlighting strategies and tools that are work in Montana communities that are trying to address migration issues before it takes all the special things and make them lost. And then finally, our last session will be on December 3rd, and we'll be taking a break from the formality of presenting, and it'll be inviting you to be part of a unique session where we kind of unpack and talk about what we learned and collaborate on what that means to you and your community through a peer-to-peer learning environment. So we really appreciate all the sponsors and all the help that we've received to get to this point. For those, one other opportunity that's part of this series is due to the generosity of the Mountain and Resort Town Planners Summit and Frontier Forward, we do have an opportunity to provide you with APA, AICP continuing education credits. So Liz, if you can paste that website in, if you are a member of APA, we wanted to provide the link to the event code and information so that you can log it as part of your continuing education credits. So moving on, just some general things about Zoom etiquette. This session is being recorded, so we can post it later, and it can be accessible to other people. But also note that the information that we'll be asking for will be used for research data. The data will always be anonymized, and nothing will be attributed to you as an individual, but your participation is considered informed consent. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to us offline. So for the rest of the event, we're going to spend about 40 minutes in what we're considering an interactive presentation. As we've talked as a team, Danya is very adamant about you being part of this conversation. So please expect to engage via the chat, through the polls, through the Q&A. We want to have a lot of your opinions and thoughts. We know that you are part of this conversation as well and want to include you in the conversation. So I do want to highlight there are two ways that we're going to be communicating. One of them is through the chat feature, and Danya will be proposing a bunch of prompts throughout her presentation, and she's asked for me to remind you to be engaged and please respond through the chat feature. Additionally, if you have any questions, we will have an opportunity for questions at the end, and those will be posed through the Q&A features. At the bottom of your screen, you'll have two different options, the chat as well as the Q&A. So just make sure you're using those as we've, because we'll be watching one or the other. So yeah, we want to really hear what you're seeing and experiencing, and we'll be using what we learned from this webinar to inform what we do in the future. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to rename yourselves with your name and your organization. If you're not part of an organization, please let us know what community you're part of or representing. And that is done by clicking either on the small icon of where your current name is, or down at the bottom you can choose an option to rename yourself. Also make sure that your chat is set up to go to all the presenters and all the participants so we can see what your thoughts and opinions are. So with that, thank you, Liz. We have a couple people on. Liz is helping to facilitate all of the behind the scenes. So as Danya and I refer to Liz, she's the person making all the magic happen in the background. But I do want to introduce our speaker today and pass it over to Danya Ramore. She's the founder and core team member of the GNAR initiative. She's going to be talking to us about her team's research findings on the growth and development challenges in our communities. And she's going to help us set the scene for the rest of our Amenity migration series. So Danya, off to you.
All right, thanks, Jake. Again, just a little note about the future sessions we have coming up. And really, we've designed today's session to sort of set us up for our future conversations about amenity migration, in part by talking about what's already been happening in gateway and natural amenity regions throughout the West prior to COVID, and the new flood of amenity migration we think is coming your way, unfortunately or fortunately. So what I want to talk today about is growth and development in what we're calling GNARs throughout the West, and really thinking about what we've taken to calling these gnarly challenges. And I like to always start by sort of framing up how I got interested in these communities. I am from Northern Idaho. I'm from Bonner County, which looks like this. You can see it's a terrible place to live and grow up. And through growing up in Bonner County, in this area, I've always cared a lot about these natural amenity-rich places. I also have the good fortune of running a program at the University of Utah called the Environmental Dispute Resolution Program. I am a planner and a facilitator by training. And the mission of our program really is to support collaboration around complex environmental, natural resource, and public policy issues throughout the West. So we do a lot of work with rural communities as well as other communities. And through working with Bonner County and also places like the Zion National Park region, Springdale, we really started to realize that a lot of these communities in these natural amenity rich places have very similar issues, even though they in some ways are very strikingly different. So that's how we came up with this notion of what, again, we're calling NAR, Gateway and Natural Amenity Regions. And basically when we say NAR, as Jake alluded to, we're talking about regions that surround state or national parks, other public lands, scenic rivers and lakes, or other natural amenities that really make these areas places people want to come and visit, recreate, spend time. So you probably have lots of examples of NAR communities in mind already, but just to make sure we're all operating from the same framework, some of the places we think of include Park City and Moab here in Utah, Aspen, Colorado, Telluride, Colorado, Jackson, Wyoming, Tahoe, California, but also some places that you're maybe less familiar with, such as Brigham City here in Utah, or Escalante, or Torrey and Teasdale in Wayne County near Capitol Reef National Park. And so before I go any farther, we're going to start to practice using the chat. And we really want this to be an interactive session as much as it can be with over 100 participants. So we're going to ask you to open up that chat box and respond to this question. And Liz is going to paste this question into the chat for you. So it should also be there. So question I want you to just take a moment and respond to is, what gateway and natural amenity regions or NAR communities do you spend time in and care about? And I just want to remind everybody, make sure your chats are going to all panelists and attendees, otherwise only the panelists or certain audiences will see them. So if you just take a moment and share with us, what places are you living in, spending time in, caring about? And as people enter their responses, see what's coming in. And it's really cool. I love the Idaho. Love Idaho nachos, they're the best. Yeah, lots of places. Places I love to go and visit and spend time, places some of our team members are from. So you can keep those coming in. I'm gonna move on. I like to really frame this in the context of the work that I've done with these communities. So I wanna tell the story of Springdale and Zion, Utah. For those of you who know Zion, you may know that over the last few decades, visitation to Zion National Park has increased pretty drastically, from a little over 1 million in 1975 to over 3.5 million in 2015. And what's perhaps most striking is that in 2017, that number went up to 4.5 million. And that stabilized a little bit over the last few years, especially with COVID, but we just heard from the superintendent of Zion National Park that they just had the busiest September they've ever had. And that's without many international visitors. So as you probably know, especially if you spend time in the Zion area or places like Zion, this creates a lot of opportunities for the Zion region, but it's also created a lot of challenges. And that takes the it looks like impacts on the national park, right? Crowding, congestion, impacts on infrastructure. We hear often from Zion that they have trouble keeping up with restroom cleaning. It also impacts the communities and lands around Zion National Park. This is a picture from Springdale, Utah, which is right outside of the park. And you may or may not be able to see that there is a many-mile lineup of cars trying to get into the park that passes through Springdale in this picture, as well as parking all over the place as people park often illegally because they can't park in the park. And those kinds of issues we were seeing even in 2016 weren't just happening in Zion, but throughout our mighty 5 national parks here in Utah, as well as around other national parks such as Glacier in Montana, but also in places without national parks, such as Canaryville here in Utah, that became very attractive when people discovered this really cool creek and waterfall hike. So what we really started to observe, and again, this is going back to even 2016, is a lot of what we'd taken to calling big city problems in small rural towns and regions, right? And that paired with some of the unique challenges and contexts of these places. So things we were observing were affordability and issues with availability of housing, transportation issues, overwhelmed infrastructure, issues with employee attraction or retention to keep the service industry going, which was often tied to affordability of housing, issues with environmental and natural amenity impacts, concerns about economic vulnerability and the need for diversification, concerns about loss of community character, questions about the role of tourism and tourism marketing and how that was influencing these communities, concerns about reduced visitor experience, quality, concerns about climate change and what that could mean for these communities, and all of that paired with the unique social, cultural, and political dynamics of these places, as well as just challenging local, regional, state, and federal dynamics. For example, communities abutting national parks having to work together on that with counties with very different politics. And I think a lot of you probably know that concern all too well. So recognizing that those concerns seem to be prevalent, we were seeing it in a lot of communities, we wanted to actually study this in a much more rigorous way. And we really wanted to look at how pervasive are these kinds of issues across Western NAR communities, and how are NAR communities actually experiencing these things, and what are they doing to deal with them? So in 2018, with funding from the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, my team launched a planning and development study to really look at what's going on in these places throughout the West. To do that, we first had to identify, well, where are the NAR communities? There really wasn't a good categorization to capture these kinds of communities. How do you actually identify them other than you know it when you see it? So we first developed a database of Western NAR communities, and then we conducted interviews with public officials in 25 NAR communities throughout the West. And then we used those interviews to develop a survey that we ran across the whole Mountain West that was sent out to over 1,200 individuals from NAR communities. So to dig into each of those pieces a little bit more, and the first question is, well, how do you actually identify or define a NAR community? And our definition, I would say, is by no means perfect. It could definitely be refined, but based on a lot of review of the literature, our own experience working with these communities in an iterative process, we came to identify a NAR community as a small town, being a place that's between 150 to 25,000 people. I recognize places like Bozeman, Montana, and Bend, Oregon, are sort of a NAR community in their own way, but they have become big cities. So we were looking particularly at the smaller places. And really these places are defined by their proximity to natural amenities. So we define that as within 10 miles of a national park, a state park, a national forest, a scenic lake or river, or other such natural amenities. And we also decided it was important that these areas are not really urbanized areas. So not just a place right next to Salt Lake, but someplace like Park City that's far enough away that even though it has a relationship with Salt Lake City, it is its own unique community. So we define that as further than 15 miles away from an urban area by a road. So from that analysis and a GIS analysis, we identified 1,522 NAR communities throughout the West. And you can see those here on this map. That included 821 incorporated cities and then an additional 701 census designated places. So places that aren't official towns or cities. Interestingly, that set of communities constitutes 30.6% of all Mountain West communities and 61.1% of the small under 25,000 people communities in the Mountain West. So NAR communities make up a lot of our towns and cities here in the Intermountain West. As I said, we did that database exercise, and then from those set of communities, we identified places we wanted to do interviews with. And we conducted interviews with 30 public officials, including planners, town managers, mayors, in 25 different NAR communities. And those NAR communities were selected to represent a diversity of states, populations, levels of development, and different kinds of amenity types. So desert communities, ski communities, national park communities. We also talked to 2 individuals that represent organizations that work with NAR communities at a broader regional scale. From what we learned from those interviews, which I'll talk about here in a moment, we designed a survey that we then sent out regionally. And we were able to get contacts for 1,278 individuals in NAR communities throughout the West. Sent the survey out to all of those folks, and the survey was completed by a total of 333 public officials, representing 264 different communities. One thing I always like to note about the survey is this is the first time I, as a researcher, have sent out a survey and had people write back and say, thank you so much for sending out this survey. Does not usually happen for researchers. I think it really speaks to the importance of what's going on in these communities and the fact they want to be studied and they want to be helped, which we'll talk about later. So the average population of the communities that filled out the survey was 4,895, a little under 5,000. And what we learned is that that sample of communities were growing. As of, again, 2018, when we did this study, the rate of growth in those communities between 2013 and 2018 was on average 8.2%, which was above the national average for growth. They had an average per capita income of a little over 27,000, which was higher than the per capita income of the rural West communities writ large. They also had a higher rent per average than rural West communities by about $100, right, which is a significant chunk of money, which again starts to speak to some of the housing affordability issues we're going to talk about a little later. The communities in our sample were seeing higher than national average rates of housing unit and rental unit growth, which goes along with their higher growth rate. And according to our survey respondents, they were also becoming increasingly popular places to visit. Our survey respondents said that 82% of the respondents said that the number of tourists visiting their communities had increased in the last 10 years, and 42% said that increase was substantial. So I'm going to take a moment and talk through this figure. It's a pretty important figure. One of the key questions we asked people in the survey is what challenges are concerning for your community? But we first asked them, what's important to your community? And so this graphic shows what people identified as important community characteristics. And on the left in the blue are the things that are important for their entire community, and then things that are important for more than half of the community, less than half of the community, and not important on the right. And what you'll see is that well-maintained infrastructure was the top thing people identified as important for the majority of the community. But right after that was a small town feel. And we heard this consistently in our interviews, that these communities identify as small towns, and they really value and prioritize what they call their small townness. Right after that was maintaining community character and identity, followed by things such as livable wages, housing affordability, access, etc. One thing that is interesting to me about this graphic as well is here on the bottom, the fact that diverse transportation options wasn't rated as something as important for the entire community by a significant majority of participants, but more than 10% of our respondents said that they think diverse transportation options are important for their entire community. Again, thinking that these are small towns, sort of an interesting finding. So let's open up the chat again. I want to hear a little bit more from you. And Liz will copy this prompt into the chat so you have it there for you. But how important is a small town feel for the NAR communities you're familiar with, whether it's where you live or places you work or places you visit? Again, it's your own perspective. How important do you think small town feel is for those communities? So take a moment, and we'd love to hear your thoughts via the chat. And as you enter yours, you can see what other people are saying in terms of importance. So I'm seeing lots of stuff come in, and I'm seeing a lot of people saying important, very important, critical. And I think maybe it depends on the community, but we hear pretty pervasively this seems to be pretty important. So you can keep entering your thoughts as I move on. So like I said, we also asked about challenges. So we wanted to know what's important to communities, and then what's going on in your community. What are you concerned about? And we asked our survey respondents to talk about the challenges that are most important for their community. Housing affordability was just top of the list. And we heard this also in our interviews. It was just, I think pretty much every single interviewee spoke to the importance of housing affordability and the issue it presents for their community. So what you'll see here is on the right side, in the purple, are the things that people identified as extremely problematic. On the left were things that were seen as not at all problematic. And what's interesting is housing affordability came in at over 80% of respondents saying it's moderately to extremely problematic. That was followed pretty closely by average wages relative to cost of living. Those two issues are connected, so it's not surprising. Followed by lack of revenue and resources, and then income inequality, climate-related risks, and a variety of other things. And again, I want to draw attention to some of the transportation-related responses. Right there in the middle, you'll see parking-related issues and traffic and congestion, which, while not top-rated issues, were still identified as very problematic to extremely problematic by over 10% of the communities that filled out our survey. And again, it's interesting in light of the fact that these are small towns. So again, let's open up the chat, and I want to hear from you now. What are a few key challenges in the NAR communities that you're familiar with? So think about the places you're familiar with. What key challenges really are standing out for them? Maybe it's some of the things you just saw on the graphic I shared. Maybe it's something different. Seeing short-term rentals, yeah, also tied to housing affordability. Year-round employment, housing. Traffic. Again, lots of good stuff coming in. Again, thanks you all for sharing, and please keep those ideas coming in. So housing, let's talk about housing. One of the key things we explored, because it was so pervasive in our interviews, was this issue of housing. We asked a number of questions about this on our survey. As I said, over 80% of survey respondents said that housing affordability is moderately to extremely problematic for their community. And a striking 32.7%, about 33%, said it's extremely problematic. Again, these are small towns. 26 of our interviewees, representing 24 of the 25 communities we spoke to, identified housing as a really key issue for their community. So only one of the communities we spoke to said it wasn't a key issue. And about 50% of respondents said their community is not doing enough to address housing affordability. Only 8% said their community is definitely doing enough to address housing affordability. And part of this is a really tricky challenge, right? So doing enough to address it, I'm not even sure what that looks like. But I think the key takeaway is this is an issue and communities don't have it figured out and they want to get it figured out. One of the other things we were really interested in was the relationship between growth and tourism and development and community perspectives on these issues. And a lot of our questions came from the fact that observation was telling us that certain issues seem to come to the fore as NAR communities develop. Some examples of this, short-term rentals were mentioned in the chat. Communities often go from not even caring about or thinking about short-term rentals to being really concerned and maybe overwhelmed by short-term rentals. Often that is the result of having acute shortages of long-term rental stock because everything's gone to short-term rental. And at that point, we hear from communities, oh my gosh, we need to regulate short-term rentals. And unfortunately, at that point, it's often very hard to regulate things. We also hear often that tensions between residents and tourists start to appear once tourism reaches a certain level, or depending on the certain kinds of tourism the community is experiencing. And we also hear that many communities start to experience tensions between what some people call old timers and newcomers as amenity migration happens as people move into their community. We also were observing that certain kinds of NAR communities tend to have or seem to have certain kinds of issues and others don't seem to have those issues. Some examples of that, geographic constraints might actually exacerbate housing issues. There's not as much place to develop. However, they limit concerns about sprawl. Whereas in my home region in North Idaho, we've got a lot of land and no real strong geographic limits. So the community is really worried about urban sprawl, even though Sandpoint, the town I'm from, is only 10,000 people. Additionally, we hear that transportation issues are a predominant concern in some, but not all, highly developed NAR communities. For example, we see extreme transportation issues in places like Springdale and Moab. However, in some communities, it's really not an issue, even if they've got a lot of tourist development. So again, we wanted to ask some questions about growth and development to get a sense of what's really going on there and the relationship with tourism. And what we heard from survey respondents is that 34% of those folks feel that growth is moderately to extremely problematic for their community. In contrast, only 16% of our respondents said that too much tourism is moderately to extremely problematic. On a similar vein, about 31% said tensions between long-time residents and recent residents is a moderate to extreme issue, whereas less than 20% said tensions between residents and tourists is a moderate to extreme issue. Looking more into this relationship of growth, which seemed to surface as more of a concern than tourism, we wanted to look at how does growth rate in these NAR communities associate with these different challenges they've identified, such as housing affordability. And what this bullseye graphic shows you is how communities that were certain levels of growth, whether negative growth, very little growth, moderate growth, or high growth, how they tended to, on average, respond to the severity of challenges. So what you'll see is that some issues, such as climate-related risk, there's not a really strong association between the speed of growth and how people responded to the severity of that challenge. In contrast, some of these other issues here on the sort of left lower side of the graphic were reported as more of an issue in communities with high growth. So particularly issues associated with income inequality, crowding and overuse of recreation areas, environmental degradation, change in community character, and then across in the top right-hand corner, traffic and congestion. Those issues were reported as more severe in communities with high growth. Perhaps not surprising, lack of resources was reported as most severe in communities with negative growth, right? Less tax dollars. So this graphic helped us to explore, well, how do these different issues seem to associate with the rate of growth? And again, we're seeing that some, but not all issues are tied to rapid growth. So our takeaway from our analysis of all of the data is that growth appears to be as much or arguably even more of a threat to community character, livability, and this sort of small townness a lot of these communities care about, creates a variety of challenges, than does tourism. However, it's important to recognize that tourism development still presents challenges for these communities. As I noted before, 16% of survey respondents said that too much tourism was moderately to extremely problematic for their communities. And 4% said it's extremely problematic, right? That's not a big percentage, but that's a number of communities that are finding tourism developed to be extremely problematic. At least the public officials in those communities feel that to be the case. So I don't want to share too many quotes. We had so many great quotes from our interviews with folks, but I thought it'd be really helpful to share a few about this specific topic. Often when talking about tourism in their community, our interviewees talked about tourism as a love-hate relationship or as a double-edged sword. And for anybody who's calling in, I'll read this first quote I have on my slide, which is, tourism is a love-hate relationship. Everyone realizes to some degree that we're reliant on it, but that doesn't stop people from hating tourists. We don't really have the infrastructure in place to deal with high demand weekends. So in those times, it feels like we're being bombarded. And we heard many quotes like that, including the second one on this slide. In line with these findings about growth and tourism and perspectives on growth and tourism, we found when we asked communities, what communities do you want to be like, or what communities do you not want to be like, that a lot of NAR communities we talked to said they don't want to be like Vail, Aspen, or Breckenridge, Colorado, Jackson, Wyoming, or Moab, Utah. And I think it's not because there's nothing wrong with those communities. People love to go and visit and spend time in those communities. However, if you're from a town like Sandpoint or Driggs, or a lot of the communities that I'm from, my team members are from, it's hard to imagine it becoming a Vail, right? It's a totally different community. You don't see how you could stay there and raise a family there, how your kids could afford to stay there. So I think that's the sentiment people were expressing. People also said they didn't want their community to become a tourist trap or a big city, right? I think as somebody who knew Bozeman, Montana a few decades ago, it's changed a lot in the last few years. It's gone from being more of the small NAR to a big city. And that is sort of the natural progression for, I think, a lot of these places. We saw it happen with Bend, Oregon. It's happened with lots of other communities. Like I said before, and I'll keep saying it, one of the key themes we heard from these communities is they want to maintain their small townness. On the other hand, these communities often told us they also don't want to dry up, or they don't want to become an abandoned small town. And I think this is particularly true for communities that haven't really gotten on that bandwagon, haven't gotten on the growth trajectory. They also don't want to dry up. And I think these findings really speak to the boom bust nature of these communities, a lot of which were historically reliant on extraction industries, so know the boom bust from that. And they're now in this whole new world of just dealing with a new cycle of boom and bust. Okay, so I'm gonna take another quick pause there and just ask you all via the chat, what are your reactions to these findings about growth, tourism, and development in our communities? Does this resonate with you? Did anything stand out to you in particular? Do you disagree? So if you want to take a moment and just share your thoughts via the chat, it's really fun to watch your thoughts come in. And Liz, if you'd copy that, that prompt to the chat for everyone, that'd be helpful. So this one might take people a few moments to type your responses in. I want to give you a little time so no one's rushed. And what I'm seeing right now in the chat is just a few people are saying not at all surprised. Seems to, yep, this seems to ring true. Seeing it rings true for Silverton, Colorado. People are saying that, yeah, for their community, the growth rather than tourism challenge seems to be pretty accurate. And again, we're welcome to be proven wrong, but this is what our data tells us. So we want to hear your own opinions. All right, so as a few more of those responses come in, again, take your time. We really welcome your thoughts. I'm just going to keep moving us along. So we were really interested in like the so what, right? Okay, so we've got these challenges, this is happening, growth and tourism present their own issues. So what? We really listened in our interviews for some common themes in terms of, well, what do these communities need and how do we help them get there? And some of the key themes we really heard just over and over again were about the importance of proactive planning. We heard from places like Moab that they really wish that they'd started planning for this and getting prepared 10, even 20 years ago. We heard from communities that are starting to feel the upswing, they again wish they'd gotten ahead of it. And so I think this is particularly important for communities that maybe are earlier in their development trajectory. Now's the time to start planning. Now's the time to start regulating short-term rentals. Now is the time that you have the most options. That's the kind of information we heard from our interviewees. Similarly, many people spoke to the importance of really thinking and planning at a regional scale. In a place like Zion, you have multiple NAR communities, towns and cities piled on top of each other next to National Park, next to BLM land, in a county. You've got many players who are part of the puzzle who need to work together. And that was something we heard from our interviews over and over again, as well as the fact that that's hard. People often spoke to the challenges associated with local resistance to planning, as well as local political tensions that made it hard to plan and made it especially hard to plan across jurisdictional boundaries. And we also heard, unfortunately, commonly, that people, the planners, the mayors, the other public officials we spoke with feel totally overwhelmed and or in a need of additional resources and capacity. 40% of our survey respondents sort of reinforced this, saying that lack of resources or revenue is very or too extremely problematic for the community. And another 30% said it's moderately problematic. And we heard a lot of quotes along the lines of, we don't have staff capacity to deal with major crises. And again, we heard this in 2018. Now flash forward to 2020 when you've got a pandemic on your hands, right? I know a lot of you out there, especially people in communities, are dealing with this. And I just want to really validate the fact that back in 2018, capacity was seen as an issue, making it hard to deal with what people had then. And now we've got this whole new layer of complexity, which we'll talk about in a moment. So again, just to share a few really illustrative quotes. These were a few things that people said about growth that I think were representative of what a lot of others said in their interviews. One interviewee said, "We're in this big growth period, but we didn't have design guidelines in place. From a municipal standpoint, we need to get ahead of the curve so we can prepare for what's coming, but we need the time and staff and resources in order to do that." Another interviewee told us, "The way the city is trying to be forward thinking and planning isn't really welcome. County residents and commissioners are significantly more conservative than city residents, not just in a partisan political sense, but in their attitude towards any change at all." And I think these are things that probably a lot of you on the call can, they're familiar, right? You've seen it in your town or you've heard it in other towns, both the need to be proactively ahead of things, but not being ahead of the curve, and the challenges associated with trying to get ahead of the curve. So basically, one of our key takeaways as a group of folks, as Jake said, who really want to get out there and help these communities, is that help is wanted. We heard through our survey and through our interviews that NAR communities really want additional resources and help to deal with their planning, development, sustainability issues. And we heard a strong interest in getting help with model ordinances, white papers on key topics, case studies, lessons learned, best practice guidelines for NAR communities, specifically targeted towards NAR communities in their unique context, help with charrettes and design workshops, models for regional collaboration, information about different funding options, and forums, such as whether in person, not now obviously, and also webinars and things of that sort for peer-to-peer learning and sharing of innovative ideas. And we asked people explicitly on the survey whether they thought an online toolkit to help these communities would be helpful, and 95% of respondents said they thought it would. Okay, so again, take a little pause. I'm really appreciating all the conversation in the chat. So let me ask you another question, which Liz will put into the chat box. What are your reactions to these findings about proactive planning, additional capacity, and planning support? Does it resonate? Do you see a different need? Are there other challenges to planning that you think are really important? So I'm going to give a moment for folks to think about that, start to type your responses into the chat box. Once you have a chance to enter your response, you can take a moment and scan through each other saying in the chat. So I'm seeing lots of good stuff come in. I'll respond to a few things as people get their additional responses entered. We have one comment about very small planning staffs. Yeah, some of these communities have zero planning staff. Some have zero paid public officials, right? They might have a mayor who doesn't get paid anything. So that's the context some of these communities are working in. And some of those communities are on routes like going right into Zion National Park. So that's, I think, one of the additional challenges. And even for places like Springdale, Utah, which is a town of 500 people, but has a pretty robust for a small town planning staff, they're still totally overwhelmed. And some thoughts coming in, take a moment, you can look through each other's. Keep your responses coming in. So as folks maybe add a couple more things to that last question, I want people to take a moment and think about this before you actually type anything into the chat box. What tools, resources, and capacity do you think would be most helpful for NAR communities to help them plan proactively and plan at a regional scale? So take a moment and think about that. And maybe start to type your response in, but let's hold off on entering it for just a moment. All right, when folks are ready, you can start entering things. And again, take a moment after you've entered yours and look through what each other is saying. And I'll be totally forthwith that we are looking for guidance from you on the things that we could put energy into to most help in our communities. So again, I'm going to encourage folks to type some responses in the chat. Once you've entered your response, take a moment. You can look through what each other is saying. If you want to comment on each other's responses, please do. And lots of really great ideas coming in. We'd love your help producing these things and sharing them with NAR communities. I'll just say that. And Liz just made a reminder to you all to make sure that your responses are going to panelists and attendees, just that way we can all see what's going out to everybody. And so you can each other see what each other is sharing. Seeing some offers of help. If anybody wants to make an offer for help, we love that. We're going to follow up with you after today's session. That's wonderful. Again, lots of really good stuff coming in. As people enter a few more of those responses, I'm just going to again move us along a little bit. So I want to end, well, not end, but transition on a positive note. Our 2018 study wasn't all bad news. We actually were extremely surprised by the really cool things happening in our communities throughout the West, particularly what I've taken to calling big city innovations, right? In these small towns, we were seeing communities do things that big cities can't even figure out. Some cool examples were things like pop-up intersection treatments and experimenting with traffic calming measures. We also saw some really cool efforts around e-bike shares. I know the Zion region's been looking at kind of creating a regional pathway with an e-bike share program, right? These places are getting really innovative and trying to deal with their intersecting housing and transportation and worker quality of life issues. We also heard a lot of these places were doing things like creating tiny house ordinances to increase the availability of housing, or looking into land trusts for housing. And we heard over and over again that these communities really want to learn from each other and share their lessons learned with each other. And as I'll talk about later, that's really informed how we're approaching a lot of our work with the NAR initiative. So we still have lots of really good thoughts coming in for what sorts of tools and resources would be most helpful. So folks, please keep those coming. I also want to throw the question out to everybody of what innovative things have you seen NAR communities try? Maybe your community is doing something really awesome, or maybe you've seen another community that's doing something innovative out front, or even just something to really deal with these issues that could be helpful to other communities. And as you respond to this question, I would really encourage you, if you can share some specific information on which communities are doing things, what they're doing. What we learn from you, we will follow up on and see if we can get students doing case studies or deriving lessons learned. So take a moment, think about it. And when you're ready, put in any responses you have to what innovative things you're seeing these NAR communities doing, or your community is doing. And I'm seeing some good commentary back and forth on each other's comments, and super appreciate that. While some responses are coming in, I just want to say thank you to the communities that already have taken the time to share their lessons learned and experiences and the really neat things they're doing, particularly around responding to COVID with our broader community. If you're interested to learn a bit more about that, we have summaries and recordings of our past NAR initiative engagement with communities on our website. So you can go and look at our NAR initiative website and find some documentation of past conversations we've had with communities and some of the takeaways we've learned from those. Seeing all sorts of really cool things, and we're learning so much from you all. Thank you for sharing with us via the chat. Things around innovative ways of dealing with short-term rentals, housing mitigation requirements, street closures to deal with COVID this summer, net zero in Park City. Again, there's so much going on in these different communities and so much they can learn from each other so they don't have to create the wheel themselves, even though each community's needs and strategies will have to be unique to itself. So please keep those ideas coming in. If you have anything else to share, you can also always follow up with us after the fact if you have something you want to share with the broader community of NARS or something we can follow up on. So now I want to introduce the COVID catastrophe, right? So everything I talked about before is from 2018, and the world has changed this year. I know you all know that all too well, and hence why we're all here on a webinar doing our thing and communicating virtually. So as many of you probably know, early on in COVID, March and April, when it first really became present in this country, that wow, this is happening. A lot of our NAR communities, particularly ski destinations, were some of the hardest hit communities in the country in terms of caseload for COVID. Some of these small towns had the highest rates per capita of COVID in April. Follow that on with the fact that, then tourism shut down, right? And people stopped really traveling and everything shut down. And so in April, there was sort of this, oh my gosh, we have these small communities that are being overwhelmed by the spread of the virus, and they don't have the health facilities to deal with it. And then came the, wow, people aren't really traveling and these communities can't deal with the virus. So they're shutting down and their tourism economy is shutting down. And so there became this concern of, wow, can these places like Moab even survive the coronavirus? And then people started moving again, and we hopefully started wearing masks and traveling safely. And then the park started to worry about whether they could handle the tourists and whether people could visit safely without spreading the disease. Oops. And then the most recent turn of events is now people are flooding to a lot of these NAR communities because they can work remotely. And that might be temporary or it might be permanent, right? And hence the rise of the Zoom town. And why we're focusing this whole series on amenity migration. So what I really want to emphasize now, knowing that we've got a whole rest of our seminar series to talk about this issue of amenity migration and how COVID's affecting things, is that I think COVID-19 has really illuminated a number of vulnerabilities that were already in NAR communities, particularly public health vulnerabilities, such as associated with transient populations, which a lot of these communities have heavily transient populations, whether that's residents and second homeowners who are moving in and out of the country, or the visitors who are constantly moving in and out, or the workers who often are seasonal, as well as highly limited healthcare facilities and resources. Additionally, I think COVID really emphasized the economic vulnerabilities of these communities. Like I said, way back at the beginning of this presentation, a lot of these communities knew that economic diversification was important. And I think this has really driven home how important that is. A lot of these communities that are heavily reliant on tourism and service industries have really felt the weight of COVID. And I think everyone's looking for just sort of a more resilient future. So in those vulnerabilities, in those challenges, I think there are some opportunities that these NAR communities are really starting to see, which is that pressure to diversify their economy, the opportunities associated with the new influx of remote workers and amenity migrations, as well as the opportunity and arguably the need to start to plan for a more resilient future. However, in every opportunity, there's also a challenge, right? And especially with that amenity migration challenge, there's a question of, are NAR communities really ready for a major wave of amenity migration, especially places that are totally overwhelmed? Is amenity migration the new double-edged sword in love-hate relationship, just along with tourism? Is it even a Faustian bargain, right? That you welcome people in to diversify your economy and then perhaps you're no longer a small town? I mean, these are the questions and concerns I think these communities, many of the communities you represent, are dealing with right now. And really, I think the question is, what can NAR communities do to capitalize on the opportunity of amenity migration without losing the things that make them special? And I think that's really the question that I know my team, and I think many others are kind of noodling over. So let's take a moment there and pause and ask you a couple questions about COVID-19. So I'm interested to hear from folks first. What key challenges do you think COVID-19 presents for NAR communities? Maybe I hit the nail on the head, and maybe I missed a lot of important things. So let's take a moment. And again, there's great conversation going on in the chat. I'd love to hear from you if you want to enter your thoughts about what key challenges is COVID presenting for your community, other NAR communities, communities you work with? Lots of good responses already coming in. As people enter some responses, I'll just reflect on a few things. Reduced tax revenue. Yeah, we're hearing staggering numbers in terms of what the tax revenue for some of these communities has looked like over the last year. Again, the reliance on tourism and service industries has really shown up, and I think in a lot of the tax revenue for these communities. I'm seeing growth in economic inequality, already an issue, like I said, back in 2018. And I think we're seeing this throughout the country, not just in rural communities, but COVID seems to be driving that gap even farther. Lack of reliable broadband. If you don't have high-speed internet, it's real hard to get things done right now. And one of the opportunities and challenges, I think a lot of these communities are trying to rapidly get access to broadband. And once they do, there's nothing to stop the flood of remote workers, right? So increased broadband, remote workers come. If you're not ready for remote workers, you have a challenge. Again, remote workers and their high urban salaries further skewing the housing market. Yeah, right? I could talk a lot more about that, but housing was already a problem. And now if you have people moving from Seattle, New York, San Francisco with their salaries from those places to your community, it's going to be hard on the housing prices. And lots of good stuff coming in. And like I said, once you've entered your response, just take a moment and look through what each other are saying. Just this concern of how are we going to operate in the winter, right? It's a concern for all communities, but definitely a concern for our communities. So I'm going to throw another question to you all. Again, I'm a big believer in what we call problematunities. In every challenge, there's an opportunity, or in every problem, there's an opportunity. So what are some of the opportunities COVID-19 presents for NAR communities? Maybe your community or other communities. And so much good conversation going on in the chat. I can tell we're going to have a lot of really interesting things to process after this session. So as more responses come in, a few things I'm seeing, just making proactive planning more urgent, right? Or just planning in general. It's time to plan. Got to do this. Rethinking how much and what kind of tourism we want, being more intentional. Seeing some people return to communities who had to leave for jobs elsewhere. I definitely know in a place like Sandpoint, it's always been a question of how can our children stay? What jobs could they get? Historically, there haven't been a lot of even moderately paying jobs. And now remote working is creating that opportunity, right, for people to stay, not to mention people to move in. Capturing tax income from remote workers. Yeah, that's an important one, right? If you just have a bunch of people living in your community, but earning salaries elsewhere and paying taxes elsewhere, well, it doesn't work so well for infrastructure. Increased residents now and increased recreational tourism, economics associate that. Again, lots of really good things coming in. Lots of comments. And just so folks know, I know there's all sorts of commentary back and forth. I, as presenter, can't track it all, but I'm seeing some comments directed specifically to me, and I will follow up on those after the session. Quick reminder for folks, again, we're using the chat a lot to engage and share with each other, but if you have any questions you want us to discuss in the Q&A, which we're getting close to, please make sure to open up the Q&A function and enter your question in there. I think you can also comment on each other's questions, because we will not see questions in the chat. They will get lost. All right, so I think this is my last question for you all for this part of the presentation. What do you think NAR communities need, or what do they need to do in order to effectively respond to COVID-19 related challenges and opportunities? Where do we need to put energy right now? And we really welcome your thoughts on this so we can help communities, so communities can help themselves. Maybe you from communities or service providers will see something in the chat that you can take with you. Seeing first response, plan, plan, plan. And maybe because I have a PhD in planning, I totally agree with that. But I think it's kind of at the core of what needs to happen right now. And not just plans that sit on shelves, right? But engaging communities and having a vision and working toward that vision together. Seeing some things about regional focus and sharing resources and support, working with nearby communities, being open to doing things differently than we have in the past. Seeing some mentions of collaboration. Again, as a collaboration professional, I totally support that. And once you've had a chance to enter your response, take a moment and look through what each other are saying. There's lots of really good stuff in the chat. Saying a few things about pausing before taking action. I really, proactive planning should also be very thoughtful and intentional planning or decision making. Seeing some mention of the need to change state laws. I think that's an important part of the conversation. What happens at state level really influences what these communities can and can't do. A good example of that is around short-term rentals. My understanding is that VRBO and Airbnb lobbied to a lot of states to encourage them to not leave too much control at the local level. And that created some limitations at the state level. That, among other things, created some limitations at the state level for what communities can do to manage their short-term rentals. So states are part of this, state laws are part of it. We're going to work at a lot of levels. All right, so if anybody has additional thoughts, please keep those coming in. So I want to just kind of wrap up the presentation by segueing into talking about the GNAR initiative. So we did this research, we saw what was going on in communities, and we really just wanted to wade into that and be helpful. And so we've launched the GNAR initiative to be a hub, a connector for people and resources to work together to help GNAR communities and the regions around them protect the things that make these areas so special. As Jake said at the beginning of this presentation, we want all of you to become part of that problem-solving enterprise. We can't do it on our own, but we're here to help and we're here to connect. The ways we're thinking about our work is kind of in three particular buckets that hopefully are pretty encompassing. So the first is we do have a lot of ongoing work and research, just looking at what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are communities doing, what help do they need, and how can we help them? And then we're doing a variety of things related to education, such as getting students out working in our communities. If you want interns or you want classes to come help you with things, you can let us know and we'll try to facilitate that. And we're also working with public officials and training public officials in these communities to deal with these challenges. And then we really have a big emphasis on capacity building, which is getting support out to these communities in the form of helping with planning and other technical support, building an online toolkit and trying to create additional resources and tools for these communities, really connecting what I call service providers, people who can help with these communities, and providing space for these communities to learn together and from each other through our peer-to-peer forums, particularly through our GNAR network, which is for GNAR communities. To just emphasize two of those pieces, like I said, we're working on building a toolkit. It is very much a work in progress, and we would love your help in building out this toolkit. If you have ordinances, model ordinances, tools, resources that you think would be helpful for other communities, we would love to share that through the toolkit or otherwise. We also always welcome help in building new tools and resources. Additionally, the GNAR network, as I mentioned, is a network for GNAR communities to really provide a place for them to share with each other, learn with each other, and coach each other. So we encourage any communities on this call or anybody you know, any communities you know, to consider joining that GNAR network and being part of those conversations. Finally, I just want to thank NITSE, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, for funding the research I talked about today. It really helped us get all of this work going. Did want to put in a plug if anybody on the call wants to or knows people who might want to study how to plan in these GNAR communities. We have a specialization in small and resort town planning at the University of Utah in our Department of City and Metropolitan Planning. A little bit more information there. You can just look on the planning website. And then finally, got lots of information on this final slide. So if you want to get a hold of me, my contact information is up there on the top right. I also included a link for our environmental dispute resolution program. If you're looking for collaboration support or training, you can look me up and we can talk about that as well. In the bottom left-hand corner, I have the link for the GNAR website, as well as a direct link to the webpage that talks about the research I presented today, and includes a link to the article mentioned on the bottom, which was published in the Journal of the American Planning Association this summer, which shares these findings and related graphics and more information. So I'm going to leave that up for just a moment. And I think, Jake, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, right?
Yeah, thank you, Danya. Just as a reminder, please, if you have other questions, please post them in the Q&A. As Danya mentioned, the chat feature is full of really great information, but those questions tend to get lost. So I'm watching the Q&A. If anybody has a question, please post it in there. I did have a couple of questions to pose to you, Danya. One of them coming from some of the information that I've seen on the chat that I think is really interesting. But I wanted to ask you, later on in our session, we're going to talk about this, but I want you to maybe what you're seeing right now with regards to amenity migration. Are there any things that are particularly alarming or concerning to you that you're watching maybe at a regional or national standpoint?
Yeah, I would encourage anybody who's interested in this question to hop on our next webinar, because it's going to look specifically at actual data and what's going on in the numbers. I am by no means an expert in the actual stats of right now. What I can say is we're hearing some kind of scary things from communities, and all anecdotally. The most scary one I heard just recently from one of our colleagues is that we think about 30,000 people have moved into the Flathead Valley of Montana in the last 6 months. And just for perspective, that's somewhere between like 2 to 3% of Montana's population. And again, I can't validate that number, but that's what we're hearing. And we're hearing things along those lines from a number of communities, as well as just statistics such as the housing prices in Montana are the highest they've ever been. You know, lots of things like that. We're seeing reports from Park City here that just tons of people are moving in. Like it's happening. It's already happening right now. And I think one thing that's always important for NAR communities to think about is you're not a discovered community, right? You're not on the growth train. You may think it's never going to happen to you, but when Park City gets built out and Jackson gets built out and the Flathead Valley gets built out, then where do people go, right? And you might be next on the list. And I think that's really important for these communities to keep in mind, is just because you haven't been discovered doesn't mean you won't. And like I said earlier, planning ahead gives you a lot more options rather than being reactive and sort of behind the curve.
Yeah, thank you, Danya. I personally have really enjoyed watching the chat and sort of the bulk of knowledge and insights that are coming from our audience. And I'm wondering if I may, Danya, if I can pose that same question to the larger audience. I'm wondering from the audience standpoint, if you can post this in the chat as well. What are you seeing right now with regards to amenity migration that's alarming or concerning to you? And we'll give you just a minute to throw your thoughts into the chat session so we can learn from you as well.
Just a note, I'm seeing already in the chat that in one elementary school, in one person's area, there were 29 new move-ins to students in this year, which I'm guessing is an unusual number.
Yeah, I'll give everybody just about 30 more seconds. Please type something in. Again, that question is, what are you seeing right now with regards to amenity migration that's alarming to you? Yeah, some of these are situations that we're kind of hearing as well. Housing prices going through the roof, loss of space, overuse of recreation amenities, not even a single family home available for sale in the county. Like, these are pretty monumental situations. And you know, part of this, Danya, that we didn't really talk about is some of this is sort of group therapy for all of us that feel like maybe this is happening in our communities, and it's sounding like across the region and maybe across the nation this is happening, and these experiences are somewhat shared. So speaking of that, you know, the larger region, what are some things that you've seen our communities doing across maybe our Intermountain West region to address amenity migration before it overtakes these communities?
I mean, yeah, I think there's a few things. So I can't emphasize this enough, but just being ahead of the curve is really important. So getting people talking proactively about what do we want our community to be when it grows up? As some of my colleagues in these communities have said, really having that conversation and recognizing that a lot of people are going to say, we don't want our community to grow up. We don't want our community to change. Totally understand the desire to close the door behind you, right? I've arrived and I'm going to close the door and no one else is going to come. And so I think that recognizing that those tensions will exist and that there will be conservative people and liberal people and different feelings, and that's okay. And we still have to get people working together across those differences to have a shared vision and work towards that vision. Otherwise, we're all in sort of a lose-lose situation, right? The growth, the change is going to happen and we're not going to be ahead of it. Or our community is going to dry up because we don't have a vision and we're not working towards something together. So I think that approaching planning from both a proactive perspective, but also a truly collaborative perspective, really trying to get people involved in creating the future of a community and seeing how they all have to be part of it. And I think what we can do now is help a lot of these communities see what's happened to other places that wish they'd gotten ahead of it. So if your community is sort of like, we don't need to plant, we don't want growth, I think there's enough evidence and we can help you connect with communities who can help your community see like, no, this is worth planning for, this is worth being ready for. I think that that's really core. And I think fostering those regional relationships, whether it be between community to community or community and county, or with your state agencies and offices, with your public land managers, and really getting people, again, working together in tandem, even if people don't necessarily see eye to eye from the start, and just recognizing what's at risk, what's at stake by not working together, by not planning proactively, and by not engaging the community and getting people on board of trying to become something together. And that even that becoming isn't necessarily inviting more growth, just being ready for it, right? Because you can be ready for growth without inviting more of it, just being ready for it.
Yeah, thank you, Danya. Just to the audience, please continue to post questions in the Q&A feature. I will be getting to those and sort of aggregating and finding themes to pepper Danya with more hard questions. So please feel free to post those. In the meantime, I had a couple more questions. One of those is maybe more COVID specific, but over the past 7 months or so, as you've had your ear to the ground and we've been talking to some of these communities, what are some nuggets of wisdom you've come away with or across as you've been working with these NAR communities under the COVID pandemic?
You mean in terms of particularly like nuggets about how to respond to COVID or prepare for what's coming?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. I think everybody's just trying to figure it out. So part of it's just recognizing that nobody has the silver bullet, right? And that's true of urban populations as well as rural populations. And I think a lot of communities are recognizing that this was just a total blind spot for them. Like a public health crisis like this was just so not on anybody's radar. One thing I will emphasize is when we asked folks in 2018 what they're concerned about, 0 people said a pandemic, right? Nobody, that was not on anybody's radar. And so I think this has just helped people see, again, a whole new source of vulnerability and wanting to be much more prepared for not necessarily another COVID, but just these kinds of public health crises. From where are your health resources? Do you have enough in community? Do you know where to direct people? I'm just setting that up a little bit more effectively. And also, again, the whole economic diversification. A lot of these places probably had a sense that they were a little too reliant on individual industries and therefore a little fragile. I think this has really driven that home. And that's where I hope for NAR communities, you see the opportunity in amenity migration and remote workers, but that's not a panacea, right? You have to harness that potential and you've got to manage it. Otherwise it's going to overwhelm you. And this perhaps ties back to your last question, Jake, about, kind of planning ahead and how do you be prepared? I think that for some communities right now, they're just arms wide open for remote workers and inviting them and encouraging them and trying to get broadband up as quickly as possible. And that's fine as long as you're ready for a flood of people and you have a tax structure that's going to make sense if you've got a bunch of remote workers and you've got a system to deal with short-term rentals, because if people move in with $200,000 salaries and then they buy a bunch of houses and then they put them for short-term rentals, what's that going to mean? So I think one of the other things that we're really hearing from communities is as somebody said earlier in the chat, like pause for a moment before you take a bunch of action and really think about the potential unintended consequences of what you're doing or of the systems you're setting up. And I think that that's something communities are really starting to see right now. We're also hearing from a lot of communities that there's sort of what do we do if there's another wave? What if we have to totally shut down again? Are we ready for that? I think the other thing that we've heard a lot from our communities when we've had peer-to-peer learning forums is just about the importance of relationships in places where jurisdictions were talking with each other, different departments and organizations were talking with each other and working together. It seems to have been a lot more easy to respond and to be adaptive to what's coming. Whereas I think a lot of places have had to start those communications from scratch or even work through historical conflict and trying to coordinate action. And even had different jurisdictions and entities working in opposition with each other. And that's made it really hard to do what needs to be done and really hard to adapt to things as they emerge.
Awesome, thank you, Danya. I guess as I asked that question, again, some of our experts are really the people that are also on our call today. I'm wondering if I can invite the larger audience to answer the same question, which is, what are some lessons learned that you and your community have learned about community planning or yourself as a NAR community in the past 7 months? So please take a second, share with us your bits of wisdom, of knowledge, of lessons learned over the last 7 months with regards to your community. And please place that in the chat feature.
While folks do that, I'm going to stop the screen share. I'll presume everybody got the information they needed, and that way we can see each other a little bit better.
So I'll give everybody about 30 more seconds, 45 more seconds to type in some of your lessons learned to share with your colleagues as well as us, so you can see some of the nuggets of wisdom about NAR communities over the last 7 months.
And actually, while those thoughts are coming in, I'm going to respond to one of the comments that was made about climate migration, which is there are a number of colliding forces. And we're hearing from a lot of places, such as Northern Idaho, Western Montana, they feel people are moving in because they have water, right? Or they're not on fire. And I think that it's important to recognize the collision of these different forces of amenity migration might be just moving someplace for recreation opportunities, but it might truly be moving there for natural amenity of water, or getting away from areas that are burning or having other natural disasters. And I think that's just another pressure that's driving a lot of people to certain regions. So it's a really astute observation that that's going on, and we're sort of getting to practice for what might be coming down the pipeline in terms of climate migration.
Yeah, great point. So a lot of these are very on the ground, rubber meets the road, planning applications. We need more options to fit divisions in social classes. And that's one thing I wanted to bring up, Danya, that it was part of the chat before I finish this off and hit some of these questions from the audience. But one of the folks in the chat mentioned systemic inequalities and processes that reward traditional power holders, and the outcomes work for them at the expense of the workforce. And how do you really see amenity migration either minimizing that challenge or perhaps exacerbating that challenge in the future?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, right? Which direction is amenity migration going to push things? And I think this comes to the communities don't totally get to choose, but they get to intervene in the system. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, COVID-19 and some of its public health impacts and some of its influences on communities has exacerbated inequalities, income inequality, power inequality. I think that is a force that can happen. And I think also we can intervene in that. But my sense, and this is just a guess, is that amenity migration, if not managed and planned for and effectively responded to, is going to really shift at least the resource balance in these communities. Power is a really complex topic, so I'm going to be careful around that one, but it's really going to switch the resource balance. And there's going to probably be increasingly a number of haves and have-nots. And a lot of those resources may not flow into the communities and the public resources unless there's a way to harness that resource. And I think that could just create a lot of challenges for communities in terms of sort of the power balance and where power is being exerted and who feels they have a voice. So again, it's a really tricky topic. I definitely don't know the answer to it, but I think it's one of those things to be be wary of and be ready to respond to, and really think about how do you bring amenity migrants into your community as part of the community, and wanting to support the community and the community working together to get somewhere together to avoid, I think what has happened sometimes is people move in and they're second homeowners. They don't invest in schools. I mean, I grew up in a place where it was really hard to pass school bonds because most of the people who were voting didn't really have kids in school. So, I mean, you can start to have those issues where it's like investing in the community isn't a priority for a lot of people at the same time as they're deriving value from the community. And so I think there's a need to proactively bring new migrants, people moving into your community, actually into the community, into the fabric of the community, and to help them see the value of investing in the community. And I just don't think that happens naturally without effort, or often doesn't happen if there's not effort put into it.
Awesome, thank you. One question, does your research define the idea of amenity migration? So this sort of bridges your work in 2018 with what we see now.
Right.
And how do you compare it or distinguish it from the idea of tourism? If you can clarify the difference between amenity migration and tourism.
Right. So in terms of how we dealt with it in our research, really we left it to the public officials who were responding with us to respond to, you know, what are your perspectives on tourism? To what extent is an issue? And like, what are your thoughts on growth? So I won't necessarily speak so much from our past research to how I think about the difference and how I think it's playing out in these communities. Amenity migration really has this sense of permanence, right? Somebody staying for a long period of time, where tourism is people passing through your communities. Now, those things are colliding. Like the Zoomtown news article from Forbes I shared is basically like how your last vacation spot is going to become your new home. Right? And so I think for a lot of people that tourism is starting to drive more growth. And I've been saying this for years, having seen what's happening up in my home region around Sandpoint, that we often talk about tourism in these communities and don't actually pay attention to what's happening with the growth. And amenity migration is only one force driving growth, right? Growth could be internal. It could be that people are having kids and those kids are staying and they're raising families there, and that's going to be its own internal growth. Amenity migration refers to this notion of people moving in for the natural amenities. People may be moving into these communities for other reasons, like they got a job in Park City or something. More often than not, my suspicion is people are getting jobs in those communities because they want to live there, right? Like I came to Salt Lake City partially for my job, but largely for the mountains and the things that are here. So we don't have exact numbers on how many of people moving into these communities are actually amenity migrants. We don't have numbers right now on how much of it's internal growth versus exogenous growth, people coming in from outside. What I can say again is from observation and talking with lots of communities, especially with what's happening the last 6 months, something crazy is happening, right? People want to be in these places and now they can. So my suspicion is most of what's happening is driven by what we would call amenity migration. People moving to these places because they want to be there for the amenities the community offers. One thing I'll just emphasize on that front that I think is really important is it's not just the natural amenities. Right? Part of what makes these places such cool places is the towns, the cities are often pretty cool places, right? And that's driven, I think, a lot by the fact that they have these natural amenities and recreation opportunities and the money that flows with that. But I know for me with Sandpoint, it's a cool arts town. Like there's a lot of fun music there. Like there's neat things about Sandpoint, and those things partially exist because of the natural amenities, but the community itself has become an amenity. And I don't know for these communities that grow rapidly what's going to happen to their community character and what's going to change and whether they can keep that kind of coolness. And I think it's part of the amenity though is the community itself more often than not.
Great, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground and I want to be respectful of people's time. We want to end on time today. So I want to ask maybe one other question that's sort of a blended theme from some of our Q&A. It's a little bit about growth, and the question is growth inevitable or can it be capped? And then also in these efforts to manage growth, have you seen models for proactive planning, whether that be at a regional or a local scale, that you could point to that seemed like it either was ahead of the curve or maybe it worked well to address challenges that these communities were facing?
So one thing I'll say, we often ask communities like, who's got it figured out? And the answer is always no one, right? Nobody's got it totally figured out. There's no silver bullet. This is a wicked challenge, right? It's going to keep changing, and the next thing could be total dry up of these communities, right? We don't know. I know that with our conversations around the Zion National Park area, we were saying, hey, if there's a total economic downturn and people stop coming to Zion, or Zion starts getting posted as the most crowded place ever and people go somewhere else, what does that mean for your community? Right? So growth isn't inevitable, is I think a first important thing. It may be happening now, but anything could change anytime. And just planning for growth could be short-sighted, right? Planning for uncertain futures, I think, is a good thing for all of us. We talk a lot in our team about the importance of scenario planning, and I think it's particularly important for NAR communities and NAR regions because they're so influenced by outside forces, and so many things are uncertain, and they're so dependent on natural resources. So you have a big fire, and now nobody wants to come visit your national forest. Well, what does that mean? Right? So I think scenario planning is something that just ties into this, like, how can you get ahead of it? That said, I haven't seen many communities that have done that. That doesn't mean they haven't. I just haven't heard of those examples. But I think that that's one way that communities can really get ahead of it. And I think there are a lot of communities that have made really good progress in different ways. And it's kind of our job, along with others, to try and illuminate those stories. But I don't know of a place that's just got this, perfect planning thing and they've got it all figured out. And we'll go back to, this is why people have to be working together, because it's going to keep changing. Stuff's going to happen. You're going to have a wildfire, and you just want to make sure you're tracking together and working together the best you can. In terms of capping growth, there are certain things communities can do. I think a place like Jackson, Wyoming feels pretty constrained in terms of there's not many other places to grow out. So a lot of these communities are looking at growing up. There's a lot of resistance to like vertical growth, right? More urban growth and density. It is a conversation though about, can you densify and actually have people have quality of life, but live in smaller spaces? These are conversations these communities are having. But like I said, you can't really close the door behind you. You can just manage it and harness it and design for it. Create place and space that works well for that growth, not lose the open spaces that matter, things of that sort.
Awesome, thank you. There's a couple more questions that are on here that we'll probably have to leave unanswered, but if there's a specific question that we can work on as a team, feel free to email one of us. You had Danya's contact information. We'd love to maybe have an offline conversation about some of these questions that you had. I have a couple of selfish questions, Danya, if you don't mind. I had Liz make a couple of polls because I want to get sort of a pulse from this really amazing group of people with so much insight about a couple of things. So Liz, could you launch our first poll? These are really questions about how we at the NAR Initiative can interact and work best with you. What can we do to help you so it can guide our efforts moving forward? So Liz, can you launch that first poll? So if you could take just a second and answer this, your thoughts on this pretty simple question. What is the top way? So number one, for you, the NAR Initiative can assist you in your work on the NAR issues you're struggling with. So I'll give you just maybe another 30 or so. Looks like lots of people are starting to chime in. I'll give about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end our poll. So it looks like there's actually quite a bit of variation, which is great. There's a lot of things people feel like they need, and it looks like tools and resources is slightly ahead. There's a lot of needs out there for us to work on. So thank you for sharing that. I want to open up the second poll. What kinds of tools or resources would be helpful for you and your community? And it looks like everybody started to vote on all these different polling things.
They all went out at once.
So
Guys, we're still getting good at webinars.
I don't want to lose. I don't want to lose the information. It says if I relaunch it, I lose this really great information. But it looks like there's a lot of interest in building tools around housing and lodging, which is great. These buckets that we mentioned are all tools or sections of our toolkit we're working on developing. And I guess I want to echo Danya's invitation that if you do have a great tool or a resource that you could share with us that we could then share with other communities, the toolkit is really a repository for other communities to kind of a one-stop shop to get some information about this stuff. So if you have something you know of that's working well, please let us know. And then the last question, the best way for us to interact with you. We do have an email list. We are planning on doing future webinars, and this many people asked about this webinar. It will be posted, the recording will be posted to YouTube, and we'll be working up a summary of kind of key information out of those chats. So it looks like there's a lot of opportunities for us to work with you, and I wanted to point out a couple of things moving forward in the last few minutes today. So this subject that we've started to explore through your work and research, Danya, we appreciate you highlighting a lot of the backstory and history that may not have been common knowledge for many of the practitioners, communities, and support organizations that have been involved today. But it really highlights just how complicated NAR communities are, and then we add on this further complication of amenity migration. So we wanted to invite everybody to, there's 4 more of these sessions moving forward. And as Danya highlighted, they're exploring the range of amenity migration. So we want you to be part of those. Please feel free to RSVP. If you go to gnar.usu.edu, you can register for any of these sessions. While you're there, please feel free to explore our website. There's a couple of features that we mentioned during this presentation. You can join our mailing list, which will give you the most up-to-date opportunities and resources. We work really hard not to bombard emails with lots of announcements on a frequent basis. So we try to make sure that they're short, succinct, and important. So feel free to sign up for our email list. Look for our toolkit, and as I mentioned, we invite you to share any information that's been working well for you or your community that we can share more widely. And then reach out if you want to partner with us in any way, shape, or form. We would love to work with you or your community. We're always trying to grow the impact and the reach of the NAR initiative. Right now, we're doing that really on the efforts of a great steering committee and a great core team that's being supported by a handful of wonderful sponsors. We would love if you were interested in assisting with that, the NAR initiative writ large, or as we move forward, as we develop future webinars, we would love your support or assistance. With that, I want to just highlight, as we're in the process as a team of looking forward into the spring of 2021, and as we've talked about today, and has been illuminated, the idea of resiliency and how communities can plan for and work towards resiliency seems to be a theme that we keep hearing. And so we've started to work on developing a similar series of workshops and webinars that will help NAR communities focus on this idea of resiliency. So if you're interested in sponsoring, being part of, being involved in that series that we're looking to do next year, please let us know. You can reach out to myself. Again, that's jake.powell, Powell, @usu.edu, or you have Danya's contact information as well. We'd love to talk to you about how we might get involved with you. So thank you for your time today. We look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will be held October 29th. Thank you, Danya, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your participation.